I would like to introduce myself, the Vice President of Client Services for BVN Networks. You guys are familiar with most of the people from our company, and we all did introductions yesterday, so probably nothing more that you need to know about me. But I would also like to introduce Chris and Jim Brady. We have Chris Carfi with Social Business Strategy and Colony Cartographer, Art's Eye View. Chris, welcome to the panel.
Thank you.
And also Jim Brady, Editor-in-Chief of Digital First Media. Thank you both for speaking today. So the first thing we did want to do is actually ask a couple of questions of the audience so that both Jim and Chris have an idea of where everybody's expertise is in this topic. And so the first question, Kathy asked already, which was who's familiar with social graph. But the question I'd like to ask is, who has been involved or participated in the development of a social graph interface with any of the companies you're involved in? Anybody? Okay, great. So for the good of the room, this is kind of what we expected. So let's start then. Jim, why don't you give us a definition of really how you would define social graphs?
Well, it's one of those terms. There's a lot of terms in this business that are used, and everybody fills them with kind of what they believe it to be. Convergence, there's been a history of them since I've been in the digital side of things. I mean, I think for me, I'm sure I'm not given the pure definition of what a social graph is, but for us, it's trying to leverage the relationships that people have outside of our own properties and outside of our own sites to help build interest in what it is that we do. And it used to be that we threw a website up or we threw a newspaper on a doorstep, and that was sort of our one and only shot to sort of get people to be interested in what we do and how we did it. And now by leveraging the social graph, you're able to get the word about what you're doing out there to hundreds of thousands or millions of people in about 10 minutes now. And so how do we actually leverage the connections that already exist outside of our own network, because our own network's never going to be big enough to generate the page views and the audience that we need to survive. So we're going to have to leverage the structures that are being built socially outside of our own little universe.
And Chris, would you add anything in just kind of explaining Open Graph for everybody?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think of the social graph as understanding the connections between all of the individuals who are in the network, both within the organization as well as within the reader base, and understanding how those folks relate to each other, and really contrast that to another term that's out there, the interest graph, which is the list of things that any individual in that network might have some affinity or interest around. And so in understanding how those individuals connect with each other, who are the influencers, that is the people like Oprah, who are really the people who have very, very large graphs, and contrasting those, there are some individuals in those social graphs who are really strong advocates as well. They might not have the biggest megaphone, but they may be very influential to their local set of connections. Understanding really what are the key nodes in that graph is a key point in understanding how to really connect up with the individuals who are out there.
And both of you are going to talk us through one of your case studies as far as something that you have been a part of. But before we do that, let's just talk about the topic, which our topic is, Facebook and Google, is the reach worth the risk? What are the risk factors that we're talking about here, first of all, as a publisher? And I'll throw that to you, Chris.
So I would say the biggest risk is thinking about any one of these platforms, Facebook, Google+, or any of the other ones, as just another channel, as just another medium that you're pushing things out through. The biggest risk is just thinking of it as a one-way channel that you're pushing things out through, and not really understanding how to listen in those networks, as well understanding the conversations that are going on and making it a true two-way conversation, both after content has been pushed out into that network, as well as listening at the outset to understand what are the things that people in those networks really want to be engaging around.
I think the biggest risk for publishers is, and we're seeing a little bit of an example of that this week, where if you saw some of the stories that were written about the traffic from the social reader apps on Facebook, is that in the last couple of months, a lot of them have seen these dramatic drops, and it's simply because Facebook has made some changes to how they display and how they show. I mean, if you put all your eggs in any of these baskets, which is sort of our strategy, is to answer the question is we have to as publishers, we have to be on Facebook and on Twitter. I mean, to say that we should sit that out because we're afraid of giving up control is exactly why, publishing's in the situation it's in. As we, especially in the newspaper world, giving up control is viewed as, for such a long time, we controlled every part of newspaper production and delivery, and we hate the fact that other people have any control now. But if you don't play in these areas, you're doomed. But if you put all your eggs in a basket of a Facebook reader or something like that, and they decide they're going to make a couple of changes to how it's displayed and how it shows up in the news feed, the entire product can basically be destroyed overnight by, a decision that you have no input into. So I think it's minimizing your risk is to be playing a couple of different games inside any of these platforms and be trying a number of different things so that you're not subject to one algorithm change. I think Demand Media saw this last year when Google changed its algorithm. I mean, you're going to lose control, and you're going to be any morning you can wake up and find out a change has been made that's blown a hole in the side of your traffic. But I still think you have to accept that as part of the risk as opposed to not participating.
Thanks, that's helpful. So what I'd like to do is each of you take, we did have another panelist, and so your time was going to be a little bit shorter, but you have a little more time now. So if you'll spend, 7 to 10 minutes like explaining your case study and tell the group, what made you decide to take this strategy, and what were some of the decisions you had to make up front before you engaged. And then afterwards, what we want to do is talk a little bit about together, who on the team has to be on board for you to take this strategy. So Jim, why don't you tell us first?
Well, I mean, I've been in a variety of different places right now. I was at WashingtonPost.com, editor of WashingtonPost.com for a long time, and we have, obviously, I think everybody knows Don Graham's got connections at Facebook. He's been close to Mark Zuckerberg for a long time, so we were playing around on Facebook 6 or 7 years ago, trying out some of these application type things, and I think early on we tried about 5 or 6 different things on Facebook at the Post. Ironically, like the social reader is probably the 9th or 10th different project the Post has tried it with Facebook, and the first one that's really caught fire in any meaningful way. But we tried. I was there at the time, unfortunately, when most of the things we tried with Facebook didn't work. But we were early on just trying to figure out how do we leverage the fact that we have people with such diverse interests, and especially in politics, which is obviously a Washington Post specialty. So we worked on a long project with Facebook where we had them answer, I think it was 10 or 12 questions about particular social issues, and then tried to plot them on some sort of graph about where they stood politically, and then tried to match them with people who shared the same political interest. And we thought it was a pretty cool idea. And then, I can't remember what he was even called at this point, and it got an amazing number. Right off the bat, we had some insanely high number of people who had taken the thing and put it. And the other thing it did at the end of the process was you could actually then put like a little badge on your Facebook page that said, I am this political leaning. And from my perspective, it was kind of a cool idea. The problem was, for us in the case study, the one thing we never really contemplated was that a lot of people have no interest in actually advertising their political leaning on their Facebook page, even though you can actually go to Facebook now, and I find the 6 months before a presidential election on Facebook to be the most torturous time to ever go on Facebook. It is just everybody whining about everything, and everybody's, it's just, right now I can't even go on Facebook a lot of mornings because of all the political stuff. But at that time, we really felt like this thing's going to catch on. And we never really thought through the process of what's going to happen when people are done with this thing, because they've taken them. Now we've told them where they stand politically, but they really only want to know. To some ways, they only did it for their own knowledge. They didn't really want to advertise, I am moderate, or I am conservative, or I'm liberal. And so a lot of people would take the thing and then would just suppress the ability to actually put it up on Facebook. And so the thing, after an amazing start, and we were patting ourselves on the back, we just missed the most obvious part of this. It is not an inherently social piece of information to where you are politically. So a lot of people just would not finish the quiz or wouldn't post the thing on their Facebook page. And because of that, it never got into the stream, because what we were hoping for was, and this is even, frankly, I think this might have even been before the news feed, but we couldn't get any momentum going on it because it required people to sort of say, hey, I took the Washington Post political thing and I am a conservative, and that would get somebody else to use it and somebody else to use it. But people didn't want to didn't want to publish it at all for the most part. And so the thing which started with amazingly high hopes just died a crash and burn death in about 90 days after the amazing start, because we just completely missed the obvious point, which is if it's not inherently social and if it's not something people want to share, the information you're gathering is pretty useless. And so that was our case study. And from that point on, I think we got a little smarter about starting with the question of the only things you can do on Facebook that are going to work are things that people want to pass on or want to be able to share with some unique spin on it. And that political leaning, as it turns out, is not one of them.
So that everybody doesn't have to hold their questions to the end, does anybody have a question that they may want to ask about that particular case study before I move on? Okay, all right, Chris, will you tell us about your experience?
Indeed. So we've been work for an organization called Ant's Eye View, and we work as management and strategy advisors to large, complex organizations, helping them figure out what this whole social thing means. And we've worked with everybody from Cisco to Google to AT&T and Starbucks in very, very, very complex environments. And one of the things that we've noticed with all of these organizations is across all the different case studies we've had and that we've worked with, it's not a thing like you weren't social and then the next day you wake up and your organization all of a sudden is. It's very much a progression. It's very much a journey that organizations go through, starting out very, very traditionally. Typically, we'll see organizations doing some experiments in some parts of their organization. You might have somebody who's really kind of a maverick who is saying, okay, we're just going to go out and frickin' do this thing. And they start working on something, and it gets some notice. They get some business benefits. They get some more traction. They get more visibility around the things that they hadn't been able to do before. And from that standpoint, they then start looking at how they are going to actually get that more operational across the organization. So you have maybe a couple of folks in the organization. I don't know if in some of the things that you've worked on, it's been, there have been a couple of folks said, yeah, we just want to go do this. And then from there they learn that, oh, okay, these are the things that are working, these are the things that aren't. And those things that are the cases that do work well, those are the ones that you sort of put some guardrails around, put some processes in place, and then start to scale it. And at that point, you can get to that next step on the journey where you start seeing actual business benefits. And the most interesting things in the organizations that we've seen do really, really, really great things are not, there's not like somebody who is in charge of social. There's not like somebody who's in charge of Facebook. The organizations that really, really, really kick butt have this concept and this ethos at the DNA level of everybody in the organization. So it's not just a channel thing, it's not just a publishing thing, it is a, how do we change the culture of the organization? How do we get folks within the organization to have the skills and the understanding and the guardrails and the playbooks and all the things internally to know what they should do in any particular situation? And the organizations that we've worked with really have progressed through those journeys, and that takes years in a lot of cases. It's not something that you do in a quarter. It's at least 18 months, 24 months, 36 months or longer to actually progress and change how these different organizations are working. So I don't know if that kind of meets with what you've seen as well.
Yeah, and I'd say if you're in the media, what I always tell whenever we hire anybody is like a social media producer, a social media editor, we always tell them your job is to make your job irrelevant.
Yep.
Like as quickly as you possibly can, this job needs to be irrelevant so that everybody inside this company thinks socially. And believe me, if you do that in 12 months, we will find another job for you here, so don't worry about. But I mean, I think that's the problem, and we continue to like name people like you're responsible for this, and those of you who've worked in newsrooms know that if a lot of folks in newsrooms like to say like, well, that person's responsible for social then, so I don't have to worry about it anymore. And that can't be the case. So
yeah, it gets like grafted onto the side.
Yeah, like just go talk to the social person over there, and it can't be that way. And so it's the same reason when I got calls over the years about like chief digital officer of like a newspaper company. It's like, well, can I meet your chief print officer? Oh wait, you don't have one of those because everybody works in print, and you need a chief digital officer because it's not in the DNA. And I think with social, it has to be in the DNA of everybody. So, and I think in most newsrooms, I'd say it's probably not. I mean, a quick case study of just how I still think a lot of newsrooms don't understand how to use social is when I was doing a startup in DC about 3 years ago called TBD.com, and that was around the time that, if anybody remembers, there was a hostage crisis where the Discovery Channel building had someone break into the lobby and hold a bunch of people hostage. And we were watching the Twitter sphere of all the DC media, and it was kind of like the first hour after it happened, everybody was putting all these details out there that they were getting off the scanner, and the TV trucks were bragging we're the first truck on the scene. Everybody was just thinking about, I'm communicating out everything I know about this particular story. Our social media editor, because she was thinking differently, and it's just terrific, was out on Twitter looking for information that we could actually use in news gathering, as opposed to just bragging about how fast our news truck got there and who we had on the scene. And she found out that there were about 60 photos that had been uploaded from people inside the Discovery building who were trapped on the upper floors, like taking pictures of cops running with guns drawn, and they had these amazing photos, but nobody in the news media in DC was looking for anything on Twitter that was actually news. They were just bragging about their own coverage. And so we went out and put a photo gallery together of all these pictures and got crazy page views off of it, because we were the only ones at that time who were actually looking into Twitter as there's stuff on here we can actually pull out, as opposed to just going out there with stuff. And so I think those kind of case studies are increasingly common in media now, but they weren't a couple of years ago, where everybody just sees every new microphone as something to yell into, as opposed to understanding that stuff can come back.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the interesting thing there was having just that insight that, we can listen out there and react and engage, as opposed to just pushing things through that channel, was the key differentiator in that case.
Yeah, and the other thing she did that day, which none of us thought of, and this is like a lot of us who've been in media and digital for a long time, we were attached to a local TV station as part of that story too, and the TV folks came and said, is there any way we can find somebody who's in the building? Because the people on the upper floors weren't in immediate danger. It was the lobby that was being held hostage, but they just couldn't get out of the building. And so can we find somebody on an upper floor that we can get on TV? And we're all going, does anybody know anybody who works at the Discovery Channel? And again, the same social media editor comes up and goes, there's like 7 people checked in on Foursquare. So I'm going to just see if I can ping a few of them and confirm that they're in the building. And if they are, then we'll put them on the air. And it was just like, here's a tool which only purpose is to basically say, I am here. And none of us thought to even look at it to find out who was there. And so it's like using tools like that, and I think in newsrooms, that's what gets journalists to buy into socialism, when you can connect it to how it actually makes the work better, as opposed to just the technology. But I think it's more better in newsrooms now, but a lot of the ones I visit still don't understand how these things are really two-way.
Yeah, it was interesting when Kara the Swisher was talking, she used that idea and that word intention. And people are out there, we don't really need to guess. We have all of these stories about big data and Amazon and Facebook and Apple and Google having all this huge data. There's also a concept of small data. It's all of this stuff out there that Jim has put out there, and just focusing on the individual, focusing on a particular use case and a particular need. You can learn so much if you just listen and look and engage at that level, and not just think about great masses of individuals, but think about individuals as well.
Yeah.
People will tell you what they want if you just go out there and see the types of signals that they're putting out there. And oftentimes they'll say, okay, I am interested in X, or I'm having a problem with Y, or who can tell me about Z. And if somebody is saying, who can tell me about Z, if you're publishing information that happens to answer that question, go engage with that person.
Yeah, and I think that is a problem as we look at the sheer numbers of people who are out in social media and always think the best answer is to throw something out to all of them, as opposed to, we have people who cover niche topics in a lot of our papers. They may be covering energy, right? I mean, you can throw something out onto all of Twitter if you want, but if you were really smart, you'd be sitting here building Twitter list after Twitter list of people who are leaders in the industry of energy, and you'd rather send something out to that, sort of get something out to that list of 20 people and just throw something out onto Twitter in front of 20 million. I mean, you can obviously everything, it's fine if a lot of people see it, but you should be having a more targeted strategy. How do you reach people in specifically who can move the social graph and who can get that story into the hands of people who are more relevant to that topic than just getting it in front of a lot of people. And I think that's sort of like the old homepage argument. I need to be on the homepage. It's like, well, not really, because your topic's pretty niche. Why don't you go out there and find people who are interested in this topic away from the homepage? And they usually find better results when they do that, because it's about relevancy and not mass.
Yep.
So, of everybody in the room, whose organizations have that social person versus the culture, the person? And who would say they have the social culture? So, where I think we'd like to know is, how do we get from having the social person to this social culture? Where do we start?
Yeah. I mean, I think it has to be largely about training. I mean, we've done at the company, and Digital First Media, which I'm the editor of, we oversee Media News Group and Journal Register, so some about 75 daily papers, including the Merc and a bunch of papers around San Francisco. And what we've tried to do on the training front is really, and I think I said this earlier, is you have to train with the answer to the question, you have to answer the question of how does this make my work better? How does this help me in my day-to-day being a journalist? So fill in whatever the job title is. I think a lot of training we do for digital, like, is so focused on like how to do things. Like, here's how you set up a column in TweetDeck. Well, who gives a crap about how I set up a column in TweetDeck until you can explain to me why I'm even using TweetDeck? Like, what's the purpose of this entire exercise? I mean, well, how is this going to make my work better? And then you tell a story like the Discovery Channel thing about how we got information out of Twitter, or you tell these other stories that the end result is always it made my story better because I was on Twitter doing something. And then they go, oh, cool, so how do I set up a column again? And all of a sudden they're setting up 20 columns because you've actually answered the question of why this makes the work better. And I think I've sat in so many training sessions where they start with, push this button, set this up, fill this in, and people are just going like, how about the why before we get to the how? And I'm amazed at how often I see terrible training when it comes to social, and even panels at conferences I've helped organize. You're sitting out there watching it going, this is totally the wrong order.
Yeah.
You know, they're getting in front of themselves, so.
Yeah, violent agreement on that. It's finding,
Back
you
off.
know, There we go.
Yeah, that's a violent.
no, it's finding those stories within the organization where there has been, because someone in your organization is doing this right.
Mm-hmm.
It's find who that person is, get that person to tell their stories. You know, we're all storytellers. That's kind of like what we do. Mm-hmm. And so find what those stories are, like the Discovery Channel story. Make sure that those stories are captured in a way that they're very easily understandable, easily digestible, easily shareable within the organization. Come up with really kind of 3 sets of things. One is the curriculum. You know, what are the kind of stories that you want people to work through? What are the examples and the concepts that you're trying to make sure that everybody has at that DNA level? Come up with a certification and a way of understanding who are the individuals within the organization who actually do have these skills, who have told these stories, who have embodied these traits that you're looking for, and then make sure that you've pulled those stories out and have that content that folks can go to. And if you have the curriculum and the certification and the content and put that stuff together in a way that's easily findable, easily digestible, easily usable, we've worked with companies like Dell to build these types of programs, and for them, you know, sometimes it's a series of documents, sometimes it's, you know, a set of iPad apps, and they actually have playbooks that they distribute in this case with all of these stories and the guidelines and the rules that they need, and just make it really, really easy.
Yeah, and start small. I mean, I went to visit a newsroom that will go unnamed, but just to not call this person out, but I walked in to meet with the newsroom, and there was a guy who walked in who had the buzz cut like he was from he'd come out of college in the 1960s, and he kind of, whenever somebody sits back in a chair and folds their arms when you're talking to the newsroom, you know they think you're full of crap. So, and I was talking about Twitter, and he goes, you know, Twitter. So explain to me why the hell we should be on Twitter. And I said, I'm not interested in telling people what I had for lunch, of course, which is like the line where you know they've never even looked at it before, because that's like the cliche line about Twitter. And I said, well, I explained it, and tell me what stories you're doing in the next week. And one of them was going to be a hearing he was going to. And I said, well, why don't you just practice, live tweet it? Just go out there and write a couple of short bits about things you're hearing at this meeting. He said, well, I'm probably not even writing a story about this meeting. I'm just going to listen in. And I said, well, that's the point. If you might not even write a story, but inevitably 5 or 6 interesting things will come out of this hearing. Why don't you live tweet them? And the guy sent me a note saying, like, that was great. I didn't write a story. I got all the stuff out there. Now I'm getting followed by the county commissioner. I started getting followed by all these people because I was tweeting about this event. And now the guy's like tweeting 50 times a week. But it was like, I think it was more fear than anything. He just really, a lot of people respond to fear by just demeaning the tools they don't understand. And now the guy's out there going wild on Twitter, and I keep sending him encouragement every couple of weeks when I see him tweet something really good. But it's just, I think you have to overcome the fear, and some of it has to come from like a corporate level where you're telling him it's okay to screw up on Twitter. Our CEO, a guy named John Payton, on his blog posted our three rules of social media, and they're all blank. Because what we didn't want to do was go down the road of putting out a 27-page social media policy. Because you give a journalist a 27-page social media policy, they're never going to tweet. They're not even going to read it. They're just going to go, there's a lot of problem. I'm going to step in something. Look, if any document this long is fraught with peril. And so they weren't. So we just said, look, be smart. and you're luckily, about 99% of the time, people are smart. We still have a couple we have to go remind that since we have no rules, we can't say they broke a rule, but we can remind them that being smart is still the easiest rule of all. But most people, given freedom and given the ability to try this, will do pretty well.
And to riff on that, if your policy is be smart or don't be dumb, that's a great place to start. Even before that, though, understand and have in place, okay, what if something does go slightly sideways? Understanding, how do we understand, is this really a crisis or not? Is this something that we need to act on? There are always going to be people out there who have controversial or oppositional things to say, and understand that, is this something that we need to act on? We don't necessarily need to answer to everything, figuring out what's the right triage level for things that are being said out there. If something does start to drift off the rails a little bit, understand before sort of what is that flow chart of these are the things that we're going to respond to, these are the things we're not going to respond to, these are the things that we're going to escalate, these are the things that we're just going to let run their course because they may end up resolving. And when you do have really impassioned readers, really impassioned fans, it's funny, everybody on Facebook's got, like us on Facebook. Like is an okay thing, and those individuals that like you, some of them will really, really be impassioned about the brand, and they'll really, really love you. There's going to be a small group of folks who are so impassioned that they actually defend the organization. And it may be okay, you might not need to respond to everything. If you've got those really passionate defenders out there, they may defend what you're doing, your writing, your content, your reporting, all of those things, and you might not need to do anything. And at that point, you're really on the right track because you have this really, really impassioned community out there that you are a part of, and they're actually acting on your behalf and in concert with you. It's not a them anymore, it's an us.
As a former publisher, this is one of the topics that was always a stumbling block, which is the fear of the bad attention. But it is inevitable we're going to get some good attention and some bad attention, and both are going to have a following. Right. So what are some of the things we can say to our organization in advance of the bad attention?
So understand first, if there is bad attention out there, or if there is something out there, let's understand, how bad is this really? How much does it really matter? Is this somebody who is a professional troll that they're always commenting negatively on things? And if so, just ignore them. In that case, if that's what they do, people are smart, and they will understand that this is just a person who's always kind of that naysayer, and don't even engage in that case. If it is bad attention because you screwed up, say, yeah, we screwed up, and here's what we're going to do to fix it, and here's the right answer. If it is something that can be fixed, fix it, and always apologize and acknowledge and thank. And those are the types of things that really get that true engagement going.
Yeah, that's the key. I mean, the best way to make good out of a bad situation is honesty and transparency. If you go on there, and you start trying to dissemble and trying to claim what you wrote wasn't really what you wrote, not what you meant, and you back up a little bit, it's just going to get you in more trouble. I mean, it just fans the flames quickly. You need to have a fire extinguisher when these things break out and not lighter fluid, as I like to say. So you got to figure out how to put this out quickly. And transparency is always the fastest way to do it. And we've had some problems where we had a couple of plagiarism issues in the last couple of 6 or 8 months in a couple of papers, and gotten called out on it and investigated and dealt with it, and very publicly said, you're right, we were caught, one of our reporters was caught plagiarizing, that person has been terminated, and here's our explanation of it. We don't try to hide anything. We just get out there and try to deal with it as quickly as possible. And the response is usually kudos to Digital First Media for the speed and the transparency in which they handle this issue, and it goes away rather quickly. But the more you keep these things alive, I mean, that's a lesson for whatever reason we're still trying to learn in this country. 40 years after Watergate, at some point, trying to cover things up is always going to end up worse than just admitting you made a mistake and moving on.
Which brings another topic I think that publishers and editors have as a concern, which is, this is my content or my publication's content. So once I put this on a social media, what is the licensing ruling, and where does, my ownership of the content begin and end? And how do we, as organizations, need to look at that? Either of you.
I mean, I guess those are all questions that are worthy of thought. But if you're thinking about answering those questions before you actually jump into these platforms, and you're probably going to be out of business before too long. I mean, you have to participate in these things and kind of work and understand it's fluid and understand the rules are changing. But we always know we own the content that's on our sites that we're obviously pointing to. We're putting up on through all these platforms pretty dramatically. So I think that's pretty clear that we're trying to get people to link back to us, and so putting our own links out there is not going to hurt us in any meaningful way. But we understand that there's a lot of rules around, and now this is coming up with Pinterest and photo rights, and how are we going to handle that? Can we put photos up that we didn't take, and is AP going to let us use AP photos on Pinterest? Is that a whole other fee we have to pay now? So we know there's a lot of those issues that have to be sorted out, but I think we take the mindset that we kind of sort them out in real time and participate pretty wholeheartedly while those get worked out.
Yeah, and there's so many different aspects of that. There are the traditional copyright sides of things. There are things, if you haven't had a chance to explore some of the things out there around a concept called Creative Commons, which is at creativecommons.org. It's a whole parallel set of licenses that up front say, okay, here is exactly how this content can and should be used, and it ranges all the way from traditional copyright all the way up through, you can use this for any concept and any application you want as long as you give us links and attribution back. And so there's a whole spectrum of different ways to deal with that licensing and content issue.
But the control thing is the thing that drives me the craziest. I was on a panel last year at a conference, and I hadn't really read the description of the title of the panel. I knew the description, but I hadn't read the title. And I was up there looking at the little thing, and it said, "How to participate in social media without giving up control." And I remember thinking, I just got up and said, I hadn't seen this until just now, but the answer is you can't. Thanks for coming.
Yep.
It was but this is how publishers think. It's like, how do I participate in all of these things but maintain ultimate and complete control over everything I have out in the world? And you just can't. And that's just this sort of a suicidal point of view, which I still see common in a lot of news organizations, which is we're not putting our stuff out there. We don't control that platform. So you're going to build your entire strategy around getting people to your website. Good luck. Good luck with that. And I think that's why it's why all the questions Rachel's asking are ones that we're involved in, and obviously fair use is a common problem with media. How much of our stuff are we willing to let people use on Google Plus and Facebook before they actually send people to our site, if they bother to do that at all? And those are all things that we have a lot of lawyers and other folks kind of thinking about and working on, but it hasn't stopped us from kind of jumping in head first.
One of the things we talked about that you'd like to also discuss is just being part of the social engagement journey. So rather than just being a publisher, I'm on the journey with them. Chris, you want to talk a little bit about that topic?
Yeah, we alluded to it a little bit earlier, and it's really this concept that for your organization, this isn't something that you turn on and all of a sudden, boom, we are social. It is something that takes literally years to get to that point. You need to start and do some experiments, get some early wins, find the folks who are within the organization who are really the impassioned ones who can be part of that coalition to help you get change happening within the organization as well. Then after you've got some good wins, got some good experiments going, at that point then you know what works for you, what works for your audience, what works for your community. Start to put in place some of those policies and procedures and ways of getting scale across the organization so everybody can do it well and quickly. And at that point, you can then really start to figure out what are the different benefits that you're getting. Are they financial? Are they relationship oriented with your community and your reader base? And over time, that journey will allow you to get to that point where it really is at the DNA of everybody in the organization. But again, it takes literally years to get there.
Yeah, and that is really a marathon. And I think that's the one thing you have to deal with when you're getting people onto Twitter and onto Facebook is the initial desire. Like I put something up on Twitter yesterday, only got retweeted twice. Like, you're only being followed by 12 people. So, like, I mean, you know, at some level, you're just not going to get that many. That's the purpose of why you're working to build
That's like
up this
18%
following.
engagement.
I
That's
know,
awesome.
it's awesome. But, like, they kind of expect they're going to go onto Twitter and an alert's going to go out to everybody on Twitter that, you know, the business reporter from the Denver Post is now online and everyone's going to start following. It just doesn't work that way. So you do have to be patient, and you have to understand it takes a while to build things up, and that you'll step in a few piles here and there that you'll have to recover from. But, you know, and a lot of the people say, well, a lot of the responses I get are kind of, you know, people saying kind of snotty things about the article I wrote. And I said, well, you know, the rule in media is we like good attention the most, we like bad attention the second most, and we really fear getting no attention. So in the end, like, you can turn that middle person into someone who might actually like you, but you got to respond and you've got to have a two-way engagement. And that's I think the last piece of this for a lot of journalists is they have to be on Twitter putting stuff out there, but they're kind of terrified of actually getting into a dialogue because they're afraid they're going to express an opinion they shouldn't express, or they're afraid they're going to jump on somebody a little more harshly than they should. But I mean, we're getting there, and I think we have probably about 85% of the journalists at Digital First are on Twitter now, and probably a good 45% of them, I would say, are pretty frequent tweeters, and all of our properties are on Facebook. Probably everybody was on Facebook before, but Twitter was the one that was a harder sell for a lot of journalists because there was no personal angle to that, really. That was like really a professional thing.
Jim and Chris, you've answered a lot of great questions and given us some things to think about. What I'd like to do, we have about 5 minutes, is to open the floor for any questions. We have one in the back of the room.
Interesting conversation. Thanks, guys. Jim, going back to the culture, one of the things I'm struggling with is how to get, and it just seems intuitive, people who write headlines for a living should kind of figure out how to write compelling headlines.
Yeah.
What culturally do you have to do to sort of get the person who wrote a very fact-based headline in print, for print or online, to get an engaging tweet?
Yeah, it's funny that a lot of copy editing, a lot of copy editors over the years have griped about the fact that we've gone to like SEO-friendly headlines, where all the punny headlines and all those headlines are don't really work for Google. Now here's an opportunity to take that skill and reuse it again, which is how to make this something you want to click on in 140 characters, 120 really, if you take the link. So I mean, I think that it's not happening yet. And I would look at Jay Rosen, who tweets a lot about journalism, is very good at figuring out how to take like what's the gist of this, what's the thing that's going to make me want to click the most, and go at that. And we launched something last week at our company across all of our properties. It's called American Homecomings, where we're telling the stories about 8 returning soldiers from Afghanistan and Iraq over the course of a year, and through video and blogging and all sorts of engagement that we're doing across the country. And my tweet, and I'm running around like crazy, so it's just like, very proud to announce we launched American Homecomings today. Which is great, except if you're reading that from the outside, you have no idea what the hell it is. It sounds like we might have launched a greeting card company or something.
Right.
And Jay sent me something. I asked him, would you mind retweeting this, because he's on our advisory board, and he put something out that was just artful in 140 words, which made you really want to click on it, which is just like, just looked at it in a way that I wish I had. And there's a lesson there about how to really spend time actually working on those 120 characters if you want engagement. But so many people are just, it's a factory of just like knocking out links all day long. Or a lot of them, shockingly, some news organizations still pull from an RSS feed, where they get like, you don't even get the whole headline in there before you run out of characters. So yeah, I do think that's going to be, I think you're going to see that change in the next, starting to see it already, but start to see news organizations actually spending time teaching people how to write in 140 characters, because that's a lost art.
Yeah, that was a question that I had as you two were talking. It struck me, especially around how do you train an organization. I have a lot of editors, a few of whom like to tweet because they're introverted and don't want to put themselves out there, right? And the ones who do, are trying to get them engaged. But I think because they're word people, they're very precious, and they want it to be perfect, and they're used to writing for print. And so they really need training on exactly what you said. How do you tweet in 140 characters to get that person to click on that link? And so when you were talking about training, I think there are 2 buckets of training, right? First, training them, how is this going to help you in your job, so that they start watching, even if they don't tweet, right? And then through that, start thinking, okay, well, maybe there's a way that I can now generate more useful information. But that next step is the hardest for everybody.
Right.
And how do we get them there?
Yeah, it's tough. And if I went back and looked at the things that were most retweeted that I ever put out there, sometimes I saw a story that was like, I remember once I just put wow, and a link, because it was something I was just kind of, and I got more clicks on that because I didn't say what it was. And that goes against everything journalists are trained to do, right? You're supposed to say what the story is in the tweet. And I just put wow, and the thing got like retweeted a billion times, probably because people clicked on it to read it when they wouldn't have if I had actually put a headline up there. So I do think that's, you know, and it's even, somebody was telling me, like, even if you think about looking at TweetDeck or looking at Twitter, like a really short tweet pops out because everybody always wants to use all 140 characters. So if you only use like 2 and a link, that actually visually stands out in a Twitter feed. So
Yep.
it's kind of, so there's all these kind of there's all these ways that people are now starting to think about how to make things pop out in Twitter. Because at the end of the day, it's just a fire hose right in, you know, in your face. And how are you going to spot something unique in there? And that's where the training, I think, has got to head next, because it's, Jay is really good at that. If you look at his feed, you'll see most of his tweets kind of summarize the story or have that, they pull out exactly the issue that makes you want to read more.
Yeah, Jay's one of the great ones. His blog's at pressthink.org, as at jrosenNYU, I think is his Twitter handle. But just brilliant guy, and can go from 140 to 5,000 words, and anywhere in that range, just nails it.
But he writes, we've talked a lot about, he and I know because he's on our advisory board, we talk a lot, and he talks a lot about how important it is to spend time writing a tweet. Like, I don't I retweet some things, but I often want to put my own spin on that retweet. I don't just hit retweet, I'll put my own, he'll write 50 characters and then cut into what he's retweeting, but it's a very smart strategy.